Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. We just have about 3 minutes, and then we're going to get underway. So get comfortable, and I hope you guys are doing really well. I'll be right with everyone at 2:30. Hello, everybody. I'm doing really well. Nice to see you, Adeline, Jasmine, and Isabel there. Hey, Kayla, Elena, Melissa, and everyone. Hope you guys are doing really good. You had a good weekend. Hey, Flavio. Nice to see everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome back. 1 second. Okay. Draw the whiteboard. That's getting a little too. I mean, that's meta. Like it's like draw a picture of yourself drawing something. I mean, I'm not like a virtuoso artist, man. That takes like serious training. So I don't know. All right, we just got a little more time. Hi there. Hey, everyone. Caitlin and everybody else. It's good to see you guys. Okay. All right, everybody. Hey there. Welcome back. Welcome to the meeting, and thanks for your attendance and for all your hard work. This watch. This is not the greatest watch, to be honest with you. I mean, it's a Garmin watch, so it's like one of them fitness watches, and it tells me heart rate data when I'm running. You know, it's got a GPS in it, so it logs the runs. It's not a Rolly, no. I do have some big face, like looking a little more like jewelry type watches, but I don't know. It's not that great. It's a Nixon, and then I have like some other stuff. Oh, definitely, I recommend Garmin if you're a runner or if you do anything fitness-wise. Yeah, the Forerunner 235 is what I have, but there's higher up there models. Phoenix 5 is what my brother has, and it's a little better, even though he doesn't work out as much as me. It's kind of a waste on him, but anyway, yeah. And then there's also the Forerunner 935. And I have a friend with a music Garmin 435. So you look at Garmin watch, it's kind of like the standard for running and fitness for a lot of people. But yeah, I could recommend that. What's my favorite watch? What did I own, or just in general? I mean, if I could have any watch, I would probably like to have one of those Richard Mille watches that cost like $1 million, or just a Patek or something. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Anyways, welcome back, guys. So let me just start this meeting by kind of bringing us back up to speed and where we were at last time, and that transitions straight into today and the rest of the meetings this week. So next week of Wednesday is the first midterm. Well, the midterm, because there's a final and a midterm. So it's the first major, like, kind of big exam. I'm still grading the quizzes that you guys did last week, and they'll be done for sure before the end of the week, and you get the answer key and everything for that. So not to worry about that and previous assignment, which has already been graded. Other than that, we're going to finish chapter 4 this week, and then next Monday we will have a review session, and I'll give you guys a study guide, and then you're going to take your midterm exam next Wednesday. So just looking at the next couple dates on the calendar, that's what we have going on. So I guess just this week the main goal is to finish chapter 4, and then you'll have all the topics in mind for your exam. So let me just wrap up the last few notes in chapter 3, which is all about language and communication. So when we were here, previous meeting, we talked about different types of definitions. We talked about different functions of language, what language itself is, what what is the difference between connotative and denotative meaning, what are qualities of a good criteria of a good definition. And then I think as we closed the meeting last time, we were talking about these different communication styles. So briefly, let me remind you about the communication styles. 4 communication styles, or 4 styles of communication, either way you want to say it. You have the aggressive. With aggressive communication, the person just wants to get their way at all costs, even if that involves being rude, loud, offensive, or just hurting people's feelings and destroying or damaging relationships. Another type, passive communication, is a type of person who they want to avoid conflict and confrontation so much that they are just kind of like a pushover and they back down very easily. So, I mean, that's another communication style. It's kind of the opposite extreme from the aggressive person. You have the assertive communication style. That is seen in a person who will tell you in a calm and confident, straightforward way what they want or need, but they also know how to hold back, and they know how to keep it within reasonable limits so that they don't end up hurting people's feelings or undermining a relationship. So assertive is a nice happy medium. And then finally there's passive aggressive. Passive aggressive communication is, so the person will not tell you directly what they want or need because they're too passive. But the aggressive person does. So they'll resort to indirect strategies of manipulation to get their way. So, depending on which type of communication style that you favor or that people that you deal with favor, you have to kind of sometimes adjust also according to the needs of the situation. I don't know if I mentioned a hypothetical case that we can use to examine the different methods of communication that you see written here. But for example, suppose that you had a roommate and there's a common living space where there's several roommates, and everyone does their chores and picks up after themselves like a good roommate, except for one of them. The one roommate's really messy, constantly creating dishes and other clutter, and everyone kind of has to clean up after them. So suppose that the other roommates have discussed this privately with each other, and they've made a decision that they need to speak to him about it to address the problem. Now, if you have the communicator that's aggressive who's been sent out to address this problem with our delinquent roommate, what kind of way of communicating do you think that would involve? Well, it'd be aggressive. So you can just imagine, it's like, hey, what's up? I don't know, what's wrong? Yeah, there's definitely a problem. I have a problem with you. You're not doing our dishes, your dishes. We all clean up our stuff except for you. So, I mean, you're like a slob. You're a pig. You don't know how to clean up after yourself. I don't know who raised you, but they need to check in with somebody because something's wrong with you. Why can't you clean up, man? Clean up. Clean up the house. The person's getting hurt. They're getting offended. Their feelings are getting crushed. But the aggressive communicator doesn't care about that because they just want to get their way. Okay? The passive communicator, they would really be reluctant to even bring the issue up. And if they got any pushback at all, they would quickly back down. Hey, sorry, do you have a minute? I don't want to bug you. We could talk about it another time if that's better. All right, okay, well, anyway, yeah. So with the dishes thing, like we do a lot of them, but I know I was talking to some of the guys, and it's more their problem really, but they wanted me to say to you, think you could maybe do some more of them, just to kind of help, because we do a lot of them. What's wrong with the way I don't do the dishes? Come on, what are you guys, my mom and dad? Okay, sorry, didn't want to upset you, just let it go. I don't care. It's fine. Just never mind. That's the passive person, right? They don't want to really bring it up, and if it comes to some kind of contentious moment, they're going to just fold, okay? Sometimes being passive has its place. Sometimes the number one thing you're concerned about is just maintaining everyone's good feelings and not upsetting anybody. But it's not a very good way to get things done. It's not a very good way to accomplish goals that you have. You know, you're going to be a poor negotiator for like your salary or anything else in life if you're that passive. Finally, well, not finally, two more. Assertive. The assertive communicator is a nice balance. They'll tell you what they want or they need. They'll say it calmly and directly, not in an overly hostile manner, but they want to let you know, and they're just going to be direct and straightforward. So, hey, you know, me and the other roommates have been talking about one problem, which is with the dishes, we all do a lot of them, and you just don't. So I'm not trying to be mean, but the thing is, it's only fair. Don't you agree that we should all do our part? I mean, we all have busy lives. So what are you getting mad at me? And I'm not getting mad at you. It's okay. We can talk about it another time later, but it's just going to keep coming up until you do a little bit more of the chores. You know, people are not happy with that. So I'm just telling you, I'm asserting myself without being rude that you should just try to do it. Okay, now passive aggressive. Maybe you put some of the guy's stuff behind the dishes so that he has to like crane his arm over it to get to it. That's not telling him directly, hey, there's a problem with your habits, but it's arranging the scene in such a way that they come to that conclusion on their own. So a passive-aggressive person might talk within earshot, in a raised tone of voice, knowing that the person can hear them, but not wanting to say it directly. So when you deal with passive-aggressive people, they try and get their way, but without saying it so upfront. And that's another way that sometimes people communicate. But I've noticed that a lot of times people find it annoying when they have to deal with a passive-aggressive person, because it's like, just tell me what you want. You know, don't make me guess. So a good leader, I think, is usually the kind that's just going to be assertive and willing to say what they need to say in order to address a problem or rectify a situation. Okay, so that was just me closing the discussion of those aggressive and assertive and passive-aggressive communication styles. Know who you're dealing with. If the other person's aggressive, sometimes you might have to butt heads with them. If they're really passive, maybe you're just going to crush them by being too aggressive. So modify your approach depending on the needs of the interaction and the context. Now, finally, as we close Chapter 3 totally and move on to Chapter 4, I wanted to talk about what are rhetorical devices. By the way, just a brief mention. In that part of the book which talks about the communication styles, there's a whole section which describes like favored styles of communication within certain cultures and within certain groups. I don't know if I agreed with everything the book had to say there, because some of it, in my judgment, relied on like stereotypes about cultural tropes that people hold with different groups. But I mean, there's probably some merit to some of it. Like they talk about how generally an American, we favor the more assertive and aggressive styles of communication as compared with like, I don't know, other global cultures, Asia, to some extent Europe. So like when you enter into a new social environment or whatever, you sometimes have to keep in mind that the way that is normal for you to communicate in your comfort zone is sometimes going to seem inappropriate in another one. Like famously, Americans are often thought of as rude and pushy, even obnoxious when we tour the world or go on vacation, even though not so easy to do anymore with COVID. But being in Europe and stuff and making just a normal order off of a menu, in America we have a service culture, which is like the customer's always right, and you feel like you have the entitlement to be a little bit pushy with the people who serve you or who work tables or baristas or whatever. But the same kind of idea is not really a common idea in like Europe. So just understand that whether it's travel to a different part of the world or just being in a different community, you sometimes have to be mindful of what's considered normal there, because just operating as you have a tendency to operate can sometimes lead to either miscommunication or, you know, hurt feelings or worse. Okay, so yeah, rhetorical devices. Last thing about language from Chapter 3. Sometimes language can be used to manipulate a person's perspective or a point of view. And that's what rhetorical devices are. They're linguistic attempts to shape a person's view without using reason or argument. And so we should always be alert to what the rhetorical devices are so that we can point them out when we see them and not be so easily misled. Now, one of them is euphemism. So what is a euphemism? That's when you replace a neutral or negative sounding word with a more positive one in order to sugarcoat the truth. Okay, what it says is one replaces a negative or neutral word with a more positive sounding one in order to sugarcoat the truth. So this is a use of language to make something basically sound better or nicer than it might otherwise sound. And this happens all the time in marketing, in media, in political speech, and sometimes just in everyday conversations. So like say, for example, a person's, a loved one has died, they're dead. They're dead and gone. That doesn't sound good. But maybe a nicer way of putting it would be to use what euphemism? Instead of just saying dead, dead in the dirt, you could say what? Anybody know? There's plenty of these when it comes to the term of death. A more euphemistic way of saying it. Passed away. Okay, good. Passed away in a better place. To go to a better place sounds much better and less final than dead. Passing away, similar. You just pass from one mortal frame of existence to the heavenly afterlife, ascended to heaven, you know. So all those are euphemistic ways of saying something that doesn't sound so pleasant, namely death. Went to the farm, kicked the bucket. Yeah, we've heard variations on this, for sure. Let's see. Somebody's going to sell something. So this is, to the buyer beware. There's a famous phrase in Latin, caveat emptor. That means that when you're out there in the consumer marketplace, beware, because people are going to probably try to sell you things at an inflated cost and poor goods and services that you might not necessarily need. So just be careful before you make a purchase, basically. Okay, so suppose someone's advertising a car, and they want to sell this car, so they want an interested buyer. But there's the thing about this car is old. This car is old, old, old. So when you say it's old, no one's going to like to hear that. Instead, though, you could make it sound better by the euphemism thing being the car, I would say, is, what's the description? A euphemism for old, decrepit, ancient. We could say that it's what? Vintage. Oh, yeah, for sure. It's vintage, it's antique, it's a classic car. It's a retro car. Rustic, vintage, exactly. These are ways of talking about the car such that you're going to come away with the takeaway, oh yeah, this is something I really want. But that sounds much better than saying it's old. It's the same car, isn't it? It's just language that is causing us to have a more favorable view about it, right? You're selling a house. The house is small. This house is tiny. This is a confined space. You're about to buy a small house. No, wait, the realtor is going to list the house in a different way of describing the small little tiny house. They could say that it's maybe what? Any guesses or suggestions? Comfy, cozy, quaint. It's a quaint, comfy, cozy little house. Doesn't that sound just snug and just nice? Now, if you say that it's tiny and cramped, no one's going to want it. So again, language can be used to try and shape our viewpoints towards things. And a euphemistic label applied to something that's not so great is the same thing, just being described differently in language. We see it happen in politics sometimes. You know, so like if you think that a person's political perspective on the topic of abortion is wrong, you know, you might describe it in a more harsh light. Oh, this person doesn't believe in the right to life. Well, pro-choice doesn't sound better than that. Or if this person doesn't believe in a woman's right to choose, oh, they're pro-life. You know, so that turns something that otherwise sounds like a negative criticism into a virtue. And you talk about has character, yeah. That's what you could say maybe about like an old beat up instrument. I see musicians doing this all the time. They're like playing on some 1975, almost halfway falling apart guitar, and they're like, oh, this car has character, man. It's been through so many gigs. It's played so many songs. Yeah, similar kind of idea. Okay, good. So you all understand euphemism. Next up, there's the opposite, which is the dysphemism. So a dysphomism is like the reverse. This is to replace a positive or neutral sounding word with a negative one in order to create or to generate disapproval towards the thing. Okay, so one replaces a positive or neutral term with a negative one. Why? In order to create disapproval. So if you want someone to have not a favorable but an unfavorable reaction or judgment towards something, then a dysphomism would be the sort of linguistic tactic to deploy. So we see this too. Someone's, let's say, smoking a cigarette, a tobacco product, and a person who finds, fault with that behavior might just say to them, "What are you doing over there? With those what?" Anyone heard this? It could be called a cigarette, which would be a more neutral way of putting it. But if you really want to slap a negative label on it, are there any such things when it comes to cigarettes? You ever heard these? Cancer sticks? Yeah, good. It's, oh, look, you're sucking away on a cancer stick, man. That's terrible. It does sound a lot worse, of course, than a tobacco product. So you're trying to create that disapproval. Here's another one. So it's kind of like been a political football over like the past, generations. But there is a policy which is called the estate tax, and sometimes known as the inheritance tax. Basically, if you have relatives like your parents with a sufficient amount of wealth in their estate, and they pass it along to you as an inheritance when they die, the government gets to collect a certain percentage of that if it exceeds a certain aggregate value. So like on estates over like a couple $1 million, the inheritance that the child receives is going to have a significant amount of it taken out by the government. That's the estate tax. But there's obviously a lot of ideological opponents to the concept of the estate tax, and they call it the death tax. Because, of course, calling it the death tax sneaks the word death in there, and it also gives it this really horrifying sound, like, oh, I'm going to be taxed just for dying? I thought one thing I'd be free to do would be to just die in peace, but now I'm even going to have my wealth taxed and a certain percentage of it deducted from my inheritance that I bequeath to the next of kin. So whether it's death tax, whether it's calling a person who's pro-choice anti-life, or pro-life, anti-choice. These would be dysphomistic ways of saying something that could have been said in a more neutral or even positive way. Okay. And then we got a couple more. So I'm erasing euphemism and dysphomism, and you've heard examples. There's also simply sarcasm, which is mentioned in the book. Sarcasm is it's the use of ridicule, irony, or kind of taunting insults to deflect critical analysis or to make fun of the target of sarcasm. So someone or something. So sarcasm. I think that young people and like your general age group are kind of masters of the sarcastic comment. It seems to be a popular mode of speech with younger folks because it's just kind of trying to be a little bit funny and silly about an otherwise more sober topic. So like the typical format of a sarcastic comment is you say something, but by the tone of voice or the context, it's obvious to everybody that you don't literally mean what you said, and often that you mean the exact opposite of what you actually said. So somebody turns around and they knock over an expensive vase or something at your parents' house, and that's a little mistake and an accident. So sarcastically, you turn to them and you're like, "Wow, I mean, smooth move. Wow, you're like the most dexterous person I've seen." You're saying something, but obviously the effect of what you have said is you're clumsy, you're awkward, you're breaking stuff. What's wrong with you? But you kind of say sarcastically, "Oh, smooth move, Butterfingers," something like that. Someone does something really foolish and unwise. You're like, "Wow, Einstein, that was a great call." I'm so excited to grow up in this country with this economy. Yeah. So a person makes a sarcastic jest type of comment. Now, about sarcasm, it's usually innocent enough. Sometimes it's just funny, especially when everyone's in on the joke and you're among friends. But I find, and I think it's something well noted, that it becomes such a second nature habit for a lot of people that after a while, nobody really knows when you're being literally serious and when you're just being ironic and joking. And after a while, I think you can even start to become a little unclear about when you were serious or when you were joking. Like for example, people, when they say something offensive or just wrong, like on the internet, and people call them out and they're like, "Why would you say that? That's like offensive, that's whatever, biased or something." And then the person, a lot of times their comeback will be, "I was just kidding, I'm being sarcastic. That's not how I really feel. That's just a silly internet comment." But people should like to have a little bit of integrity behind the things they say. After a while, it does become a bit difficult to know, where do you really stand? Are you just always kidding and joking, or do you have any real commitments and beliefs? So sarcasm can be fun and games, but there's also a role and a place in life for you to be direct, honest, and straightforward. So, I would say do when appropriate, but don't fall into it as a big habit, because it does, I think, erode the credibility of your speech after a while. Yeah, so someone thinks you're being sarcastic, but you're just mean. I mean, hey, fair enough. But it's nice to be nice. When you're mean, you kind of have to deal with yourself too. I mean, mean people are angry, and that's not really a fun way to live. So anyway, yeah, sarcasm. Next up. All right, so there's also hyperbole. Hyperbole, we've all, I think, heard of this. It's simply the use of exaggeration or overstatement to distort the truth. To distort the truth. Hyperbole. So, going beyond the facts to exaggerate and overstate things. Like someone says, "Oh, I'm so hungry, man, I could eat a cow right now." Like, not literally, the person couldn't do it. So they give this kind of hyperbolic statement to really give effect to the intensity of their hunger and communicate that. Maybe a person says, "The class was so boring, I was literally dying, watching the lecture." Not literally, but a person says that to, again, give sense of the deep boredom that they experience while they're doing that. Now, the thing about hyperbole, as with sarcasm, is that it does have its role. It's not like necessarily wrong in every case, but people who are kind of serial exaggerators, as they sometimes say, and they always exaggerate, are bound to get themselves into trouble personally, professionally, legally, some point in their life. It's fair and fun enough when you're just being hyperbolic and it has no consequences. But what if you're exaggerating your track record in relationships when you're meeting someone that you're trying to date? What if you over-exaggerate and overhype your work record when you're applying for a job? Or what if you're in a position of responsibility and you overstate facts that people depend on in order to make planning and decisions? So it's kind of, again, it's like the boy who cried wolf phenomenon. If you are always going to exaggerate, people will eventually learn that about you. And then when you really need them to take you seriously and you're being sincere, they won't really trust your words. So there's always a cost to being somewhat dishonest or just misleading. It's that people will determine that fact, and then your word no longer matters as much. So, again, so as not to erode the credibility that your statements carry. Don't give in to always exaggerating things. Of course, people like to do that because making something seem better, bigger, greater than it really is often an effective psychological tactic of persuasion. But good critical thinkers and a lot of everyday people will see through that. So that's hyperbole. And then finally, we'll just end the whole discussion of chapter 3 with a quick mention of deception. Okay, and there's two real forms of deception. So there is active and passive deception. Okay, so active deception is just the familiar concept of lying. In other words, to purposefully say something that you know is not true in order to mislead people. So to deliberately state a falsehood in order to mislead. So if that's what active deception is, does anybody have even a guess what passive deception could be? Active deception, you're saying something straight up false, and you know or believe that it's false when you say it. You're trying to misinform. You're trying to deceive. Passive deception is also deception, but it's not done in the same way. What do you think that could involve? Passive deception. So instead of saying something false, what do you think that is? Saying something false that you believe is true? No, not quite. That's not really deception. That would just be misinformation. But a good attempt. You say not deliberately. No, it's still deliberate. So it's not about it being an accident. It's something else. It's deception, but not done on the basis of saying a falsehood. Instead, it's done on the basis of what? No other guesses? I'm sure maybe one will. Okay, good, Jillian. By omission. By inaction, not by action, Jamie. So it's like lies of omission. When you withhold information from people in order to prevent them from discovering the truth. So passive deception. Withholding the truth. Okay, so let me give you an example, then you can use this example to see the difference between the two forms. Say that somebody is having an affair in a relationship they're in, and they just don't want the partner to know that, so they're thinking they will deceive them. Okay, if it was active deception, what do you think that would entail? So the person is going to engage in active deception regarding their affair. So that would mean that they do what? To actively deceive the partner about it, they would have to, in fact, what? Based on that meaning. Lie to the partner, yes. Good, Sebastian. So it would be like partner A says to B, excuse me, are you cheating on me? And they say, no, I'm not, and I never would do that. So let me tell you right now, 100% no, I'm not cheating. That is not happening, and I've never done that, and I wouldn't do that. Now, they did do it. And so they're saying something that they know isn't true in order to misinform and mislead the partner, to prevent them from getting the truth. Now, what would passive deception be in the same type of situation? Instead of like literally saying, I'm not cheating and I haven't, it would be to passively conceal the facts. So not saying something that's untrue, but rather just what? You've already kind of, I think, understood hiding it, right? Withholding the facts and information. So it just doesn't come up, Maybe they ask you, what'd you do earlier today? And you're like, I had a nice day at work, which is true, but you don't mention what you did after work, right? So, John Mulaney, the comedian, I said, no, like a liar. Yeah, so you can deceive by telling lies. You can also deceive by hiding the truth, and both are forms of deception. In a job interview, if you told the guy that you worked somewhere where you never actually worked, that's active deception. If you didn't put on your resume a place that you did work because you're trying to cover up that you worked there, that is passive deception. So passive deception doesn't require saying anything false, but it does require that you try and prevent people from learning the truth by hiding it, omitting it, or whatever. Okay, so honesty is the best policy in life. Of course, I guess there are some possible situations where like a little occasional white lie or omission can be perhaps, for a reasonable enough basis and not necessarily always to be condemned. But we all understand that to be honest is a virtue, to be a liar is a vice. So for personal, professional, and just intellectual and moral reasons, we should try our hardest to stick to honesty when and if it's possible, and in most cases we should. Okay, so we finished that chapter 3. Now we're going to just launch right into chapter 4, and we'll spend the remaining part of today and Wednesday going over all the chapter 4 stuff. So 4 is all about knowledge and the limitations to knowledge. Chapter 4, knowledge and its limits. Okay, and I don't know if maybe you remember, but way back when we met on the first day of the semester, I told you guys about how when I was in graduate school getting my PhD in philosophy, the major emphasis that I had was within epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy that deals primarily with questions concerning human knowledge. So like, what is knowledge? How do we know things? And what are the parts, components of knowing things? And so I'm actually quite, familiar with this type of material in philosophy, and I enjoy teaching it a lot. So we're going to talk about knowledge and its limits, how to evaluate evidence, and what are some of the different errors that we can make either in our judgment or in our perception even that can block our ability to sometimes get knowledge. They open the chapter with a couple of mentions of some famous cases of medical error that have happened in the past. And so these are kind of horrifying stories, but they're true. So, for example, in 1995, at a university hospital in Florida, there was this 52-year-old patient named William King. And Willie King, he was scheduled to have his leg amputated because he had taken on a gangrenous infection in that leg. So to save his life, they had to remove it. They prepped him for surgery, and they anesthetized him. And then, unfortunately, the medical team accidentally amputated the wrong leg, okay? Horrible, horrible situation. So that meant that the healthy leg had been deployed to the other one, which meant that he's now a double amputee. Horrible medical mistake, right? Other cases, they talk about the Hollywood actor Dennis Quaid. He had newborn twins that had a rare blood thinning blood disorder, and so they had to provide them with blood thinning medication, but they accidentally gave 100 times the recommended dosage, which almost killed both of the twins. And events and stories of this kind abound. Now, after such events happen, all kinds of more advanced safety procedures and protocols get developed, like having a double backup safety officer and computers monitoring every stage of the whole procedure. But the takeaway for us to learn is that even highly trained professionals in positions of great responsibility can still make cognitive errors, mistakes in the processing of information. So these things happened for no other reason than human error. And how is it that even highly trained professionals can experience these errors? Is because we're all capable of making these kind of mental mistakes. None of us are perfect, but by being good critical thinkers and trying to consider what the sources of error could be, we're more likely to catch ourselves before we make such mistakes. And we'll hopefully have better results than what we've seen in some of these examples. So just don't think that the moral of the story is, oh, incompetent fools working at the hospital just made mistakes and they're really weird people. No, instead it's like even the best and brightest among us are capable of making such errors. So therefore, we really do have to take a deliberate effort to try our best to ward them off. And knowing what those errors can be will help us to do that. So good critical thinking requires that we evaluate evidence carefully, and we are mindful and wary of cognitive errors of our own so that we avoid jumping to the wrong conclusions. And that will help us in any given situation in life. So to start with notes, let's talk about the definition of the term knowledge, which is actually very interesting and much discussed in philosophy. So knowledge is claimed to be a three-part definition. So let me put it here. So what is knowledge? knowledge is information that we believe, which is true, and for which we have got justification. All right, so okay, so the three main parts, the three ingredients, if you will, of knowledge are these three parts: belief, truth, and justification. And epistemologists, which is the sort of word for those who specialize in the theory of knowledge within philosophy, they sometimes like to summarize this down to a little acronym. And that acronym is simply that K, standing for knowledge, is equal to, JTB, where JTB stands for justified, that's the J, true, that's T, and then belief for B. Justified true belief, that's what knowledge is. So let's review each of the terms of the definition very quickly. Two of them we've already talked about in some good detail. So for you to know something, first of all, you have to at least believe it. What does it mean for someone to believe something? If you can recall this from some of our earlier meetings. If a person believes a statement, in other words, that just means what about them relative to that statement? Like if you believe that the Earth is the third planet from the sun, or if you believe that the Constitution was formed in 1776, that means that you think that it's true. Correct, yes. So to believe any sentence or statement is for you to be a person that thinks it's true. Now, what is truth? Thinking something's true is what it is to have a belief. But what is it for a sentence to actually be true? That's something we've also discussed. So remind me if you can. When a sentence is true, yes, Sebastian, it means that whatever it says matches the world and reality. So like, I guess one thing we can say that's true right now is that Professor Vulich is wearing some glasses. You can see I'm wearing them. It's true that I'm wearing them. So I say that, but it's also backed by the real fact. If I tell you I'm wearing a hat right now, that's false. It's not on my head, even if I say it. Even if maybe you're on drugs and you see me wearing a hat because you're hallucinating, you might believe it, but you'd have a false belief then. Okay, so for you to know something, these two things at least have to be there. You have to think something is true, and also it has to really be true. You have to get it right. But then there's that third ingredient, and that's something that we also have to be really clear about. So what is justification? Now here's a word that maybe you already know the meaning, or maybe you at least have a good idea of the meaning. But who could maybe throw out an attempt to define that for me? What do you think it is when a belief is justified? A justified belief means what about it? As opposed to having an unjustified belief. What does it mean when it has justification or is justified? Let's see if we have any concept of justification. What do you think? Has evidence. Good, Miguel. Yes. So justification is simply when a belief is backed by good evidence or reasons. So justification, having good evidence or reasons to believe a statement. Having good evidence or reasons to believe something. Okay, so the definition of knowledge is that it's a justified true belief. So you have to think something's true, but that's not enough. It also has to actually be true. And even if you have a belief and it's true, there's a third part which has to be there too, and that is you need to have some type of evidence or reasons that's sufficient to justify it. Okay, so when all three of those come together, you have a true belief and good evidence behind it, that means that you know that thing. But if any one of the three conditions is not met, then that is not knowledge. Okay, so for example, Could a person, is it possible for somebody to know that I'm the President of the United States right now? Could somebody have knowledge that I'm the President of the United States? Dr. Vulich. And I'm not talking about a hypothetical future time. I'm talking about right now. Is that possible to know? Of course not. Why not, Sebastian? That's correct. But why not? Why is it not something that is even eligible to be an item of knowledge? You can't know that. And the reason is simple. It's because why? It's not true, exactly. So it fails the truth requirement. It's false. I'm certainly not the president. I have no intention to ever be. But since it's false, it cannot be known. You can't know something false. Now, if someone was really deluded or just mixed up in their mind, at best, the person could not know that I'm the president, but maybe what? So it's false, so it's not eligible to be known. But if a person was really misinformed, they could at least what? Let's see. Believe it. Correct, Sebastian. So a person can believe something false, and that happens all the time. There are people walking around right now that think the earth is flat, so they have a false belief in their head right there. They think that it's flat, it's not flat. So you can't just know things that are false. You can believe things that are false. But knowing requires getting it right. Okay? So like, for example, no, Miguel, but anyway, yeah. Say you're filling out one of those multiple choice quizzes or exams in a history class, and they give you this question. The United States Constitution was ratified in, and then they give you 4 years to pick from. A, 1876. B, 1976. C, 1776. D, 2025. Okay, now you're the student. Let's pretend. You see that question on the exam, and you're like, okay, I need to prove that I know the answer. So, say the student fills in 1976. So like, man, I don't know dates at all. I really did not learn the material. So I'm putting in 1976. I'm filling in bubble B. Now, do they know the answer? Do they know the answer when they fill in B and they fill in 1976 is when the Constitution was ratified? That's not knowledge, is it? If that's what they believe, that's false. Okay? So you can only get credited by the professor or by anybody for knowing it when you get it right. That's why truth is a requirement for knowledge. If it wasn't, then we would give credit for any answer. True, false, no difference. Knowledge could be anything. But knowledge can't just be anything. It has to be the things that are actually factually correct. So that's why you get marked down when you fill in the wrong bubble, because that shows you didn't know it, because your belief about it was a false one. Now, let me give you another example. Suppose that I'm sitting here right now and I am thinking about whether there's an even or an odd number of human beings alive right now. Can you follow me? Like, we're living people, me and you talking. And there's a certain number of us on the planet. Now, could it be an even number? Yeah, if it's divisible by 2. Could it be an odd number? Also, yes, if it's not evenly divisible by the number 2. So suppose that I'm a person who just, I got a weird hatred of odd numbers. And so I just choose to believe that there's an even number of living human beings at this like frozen moment in this split second in time, because I know there's always people being born and dying. So anyway, if we could freeze time right now, let's say that I want it to be that I choose to believe that there's an even number of people. Now, do I know that? Do I know that there's an even number of people alive on the planet Earth right now? Tell me, yes or no. Is that something that I know? Okay, Judy, Natalie, no, exactly. I don't know it, but why not? Which part of the knowledge definition is failing? Because let me throw this at you. Could it be true? What's the chances that it's correct? What's the probability that it is an even number? Just based on the way that these integers work, we already know that the probability is 50-50. So I have like a coin flip chance of being correct. That's a pretty big chance. So suppose that just for the sake of discussion, that is the case. There is an even number of people, and I believe it. Then why don't I know it? That's already checking off truth and belief. So what's missing? How come I don't, I guess, know this thing? Like we are all saying, I don't know it. But it might be true. And I could say I believe it. Good, Eric. It's because there's no justification for it. So I would need to have some type of reasonable evidence to establish that that is the case. If I could somehow create an automatic census of all the human beings and I saw the number turn up, then I could say, well, that's a little bit of evidence, you know? But right now, it's just merely a probable guess. Even if it's true, it's not knowledge. So knowledge can't just be a lucky guess that happens to turn out right. It has to be a true belief that's based on some type of reasons. Now, let me give you another one example involving our hypothetical of the student filling out a multiple choice questionnaire. Go back to the example I gave where the question was, what was the year of our Declaration of Independence or Constitution being ratified? And they give you those four options. A, 1876, B, 1976, C, 1776, D, 2025. Okay, now put yourself in the mind state of this supposed student. So here they're thinking this way. Okay, what's the answer? All right, I guess I can cross off D. It can't be that one because that's in the future. And I'm pretty sure they didn't do it in the future. So it's one of the other three. All I really remember is that it's something about 76, but all of them have 76 in there. And so I'm just stumped. I'm going to have to just guess. I don't know, whatever. I guess I'll fill in 1776 because like 17 is my lucky number. You know, so they fill in that bubble. Now, did they get the answer right in that situation that I'm describing? Where they just kind of haphazardly guessed letter C. But did they get it right there? Did that student get the correct answer? Yes, they did. It is 1776 after all. And they believed it, at least for a moment. But did they know the answer was correct? No. So once again, that shows you that even a true belief is not all the way there. You can have a true belief, but if you're just guessing, then you don't really know your stuff. So who knows the answer when they fill in letter C? A different type of student who fills it in full of confidence because they say, I could tell you 10 different reasons in the history of our country as to why it was at that exact time and date. They are not just filling it in on a random hunch, but because of knowledge, which is based on their appreciation of the reasons why that's the correct answer. So, you know, when you're lucky and you fill in the right bubble, you might get credit from the professor because I guess they can't determine whether you really understood the reasons that that was the right answer or not. But when you actually know it and it's real knowledge and not just filling bubbles in and guessing, that means that the true answer is backed by reasons that you could give in defense of it being the right answer. Yeah? So I'm just explaining to you guys here, trying to give you a sensible explanation of why each of the three conditions is considered necessary. As epistemologists are fond of saying, JTB, the three conditions, are individually necessary, but only jointly sufficient, meaning that you do need each one, but only one or even two out of three is not enough. They all got to be there for you to have knowledge. I like to use this metaphor to explain that point somewhat differently. Think of these as like three ingredients that bake a cake, okay? Now, suppose that with an actual cake, you need flour, sugar, and water to create it, okay? Now, I'm not great at baking and stuff, so this is not necessarily the true list of actual ingredients. But suppose that you just needed flour, sugar, and water to make the cake. Probably eggs too, but let's keep it to three for three. Flour, sugar, and water. Each one's necessary, right? Can't have a cake without each point. But suppose that you only have the water and you don't have any flour or sugar. You have something that you need for the cake, this water, but is that enough? Is that sufficient? No. It's just a bucket of water. That by itself will never be a cake. Okay, suppose that you just have the flour. Okay, well, you need it for the cake? Sure, but it's not enough by itself. Even flour and water together gives you 2 out of the 3 needed ingredients, but it's not enough to actually make the cake. So to like bake the cake of knowledge, okay, a little metaphor extended to this example, you need all 3 of the key ingredients. 2 out of 3 is close, but it's not enough. 1 out of 3 is certainly not enough. So if you have a belief and it's true, but you have no reason to think it's true, like you have no justification, then you don't really know it. If you have a belief and it's false, then even if you have good evidence behind it, that's also not knowledge. And by the way, justified beliefs could sometimes be false. Of course, often justification leads us to the truth, but sometimes we can have misleading evidence. Like suppose that someone framed someone for a crime they did not commit. Like a police officer plants evidence to frame a person who's actually innocent. If they did that, or it doesn't need to be a police officer, but any person frames them, then when investigators arrive, they'll look at the planted evidence and they'll come to the conclusion that so-and-so is the guilty party. And they may have justification for believing that based on the way it seems. But in that case, they wouldn't know that they're guilty because they're not actually guilty. Nonetheless, they would have a justified belief in their guilt. Okay? So like if you're ever a juror, for example, sitting on a jury, you have to weigh the decision of guilt or innocence based on the evidence that's presented in court. But of course, there's been cases of false conviction where the evidence still seemed to strongly point towards their guilt. So evidence usually leads us to the correct, true conclusions, but we're not perfect, and therefore there's always some non-zero possibility that even a justified belief could turn out to be false. Okay, like when I was a little kid, everyone was telling me Santa Claus existed, my parents, my teachers, relatives, television. I would go to the mall and it looked like he was there having kids sit on his lap and make requests. So I had some evidence to believe in the reality of Santa, but that was a false belief also. So not telling you to be a super skeptic and think that everything you believe is just false because you can't have total proof. But in the basic idea of describing justification, it's theoretically possible to have a justified false belief. Anyway, when all three of those parts do line up, and it's a justified belief which does happen to be true, that's what knowledge is. At least that's the classical analysis of it, which dates back thousands of years. We have writings that have survived from the ancient Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, which describe knowledge in these ways. If you ever study epistemology at a higher level in a philosophy intro class or something, you might learn a little bit about the ancient works on this subject. And it's very interesting because it lasted for like thousands of years. It's only until the 20th century, 1963, that this guy named Edmund Gettier, an American philosopher, published a very short article which challenged this definition. And nowadays, 2020, we're no longer 100% sure that's the right definition, but that's beyond us. So JTB, it's essentially the long-standing definition of knowledge, and I've tried to discuss it in all those details. Okay, so now, as we continue to proceed through chapter 4, I just want to describe for you guys two different perspectives that people can have on the question of human knowledge. There's two sort of schools of thought, or two camps, two perspectives on human knowledge. Okay, so there's these two kind of rival camps which disagree about where most of our human knowledge comes from. What's the source of this knowledge that we get when we get it? Well, there are these two schools of thought. So on the one hand, you have those that are called empiricists. And so there's empiricism. And then there is rationalism. And who follows that are called rationalists. Okay, so first off, empiricism. Empiricism is the position that most human knowledge comes from the five senses and those things that we can observe by means of the five senses. So most human knowledge comes from the five senses and observation. Okay, so that's empiricism. Within the word empiricism, there's reference to the term empirical. And empirical evidence is just evidence that you can perceive by your five senses. So what are the five senses? You may know this. This is sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. And those five sense perception abilities do give us a lot of information about the world around us. Like, how is it that you know that I'm wearing a flannel shirt right now? It's because you have vision and you can see the visual image. When you're nearby to an emergency rescue and you don't see anything, but you hear the sirens of the fire truck blaring, that sound, the auditory information, provides you with knowledge that there's some type of emergency playing out in your community right there. So whether it be vision, whether it's sound, touch, like right now I know that I'm seated in this chair because I can feel the tactile quality of my body resting on the chair. I know that I'm holding a marker even if I couldn't see it because I can feel the contour of it in my hand. So touch is the tactile sense modality. There's smell, of course. You might smell like a barbecue happening in your neighborhood, and therefore you gain knowledge of it happening, and knowledge is derived from the sense of smell. Taste, of course, if you're eating something, then that gustatory quality provides you with knowledge about what you're eating, and etc. So anyway, some people that fall into this camp believe that that's the mainstay of human knowledge. That's where the most of it comes from the things that we can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, or by means of instruments augment our ordinary sense perception. So like telescopes can augment and enhance vision. Stethoscope can augment and enhance hearing. Some people then do prioritize that as the majority source of human knowledge. But there's another way of looking at it, and that's rationalism. So rationalism is another school of thought which says that most human knowledge comes from abstract thought and reason. So from pure reason and abstract thought. Most human knowledge, comes from reason and abstract thought. Okay, so in the rationalism school of thinking, most of our knowledge is not necessarily derived from the five senses, but instead from pure concepts that we can think about rationally in the mind, unaided by the five senses. So for example, facts having to do with mathematics, geometry, trigonometry, pure logic, they would all be the kind of items of knowledge that the rationalist emphasizes. So like, the interior angles of a triangle add to 180 degrees. All the points lying along the perimeter of a circle are equally distant from its radius. 2 + 2 = 4. And so forth and so on. So if you're talking about knowledge of those kinds, notice that it's formed in the mind. You don't have to get up, go out, and physically investigate the world by seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, or smelling anything to understand the geometric facts about triangles, about numbers, about fractions, about exponents. So to the rationalists, most human knowledge anyway comes from that kind of source. They will admit, of course, that we do have the five senses, but they would remind us that animals that are lower than humans also have those. So the kind of knowledge that makes us distinctively human are those higher abstract formal domains of knowledge that the animals can't contemplate or touch. Anyway, my view is that there's a little bit too much stratification on either side. Like both types of knowledge are important and necessary to giving a full conception of how humans come to know things. So I would just embrace both. But when one is a partisan of either side, they kind of favor the priority of the one source of knowledge and evidence over the other. Okay, so that's what I would tell you about rationalism and empiricism. Next up, I just want to make a brief mention of evidence in general. And what are some good sources of evidence? So, to begin, one second, let me just, hold on one second. Hello? This is just, okay, nothing. I just saw the 657 area code of Fullerton, so I was like, is that somehow the staff or someone affiliated with the campus, but it was an automated message. So anyway, I have my phone silenced, but I just thought, let me take a half second in case there's some emergency that they need to notify people about. But it's nothing. Automated message, just a test message of their like emergency management system or whatever. Back to what I was saying. So evidence. Evidence, the general idea of it is just it's something that can either prove or disprove a claim. Okay? So evidence is the type of stuff that you supply to make a case that something is either true or false. Okay? So if you tell a professor, I cannot attend a certain meeting, or I cannot take a test on that day because I'm going to be hospitalized and I've fallen ill, or an emergency has appeared in my life and I have to attend to this matter. Some professors might ask you, well, can you please provide documentation so I have some evidence that what you're saying is true? I trust you, but I just need to have some type of proof. So when you give them the doctor's note or whatever paperwork you may have, then you're giving evidence that proves your claim is true. If you are a prosecutor or a defense attorney, you're trying to convince the jury or the judge of the facts of the case according to your side of the argument. So to the claim that the individual accused is guilty, the prosecutor tries to give evidence to prove that claim. And on the defense attorney side, they try and establish evidence in court that shows that that claim is false, that they're not guilty, or at the very least that you have not proven on the presentation of your facts that that person's guilty. So we need evidence to have a reasonable basis to believe anything, whether that's in everyday life, academic study, legal affairs, or whatever. So evidence is needed to prove or disprove a claim, and it's also needed to have knowledge, because knowledge requires justification. Justification is basically the same as evidence. So without evidence, you would never be able to really know things. You'd just be guessing and having hunches. Now, what are some different sources of evidence? Here are some general, reliable sources of evidence. I say reliable, and usually they are, but of course there can be occasionally situations where they are not as reliable. Nonetheless, we have to rely on things like this. So first of all, there can be direct experience as evidence. That's probably some of the most powerful evidence that a person can have. It's when you yourself witness, in some way, the events that you are claiming to have happened. So like, if you were at Cal State Fullerton and a fire broke out on campus, which required them to send all the students home. I realize some of you guys are freshmen and you maybe don't even have access to campus or have, but in case of prior to COVID, that you'd been on a campus, an emergency like a fire occurred, resulting in dismissal of all classes and the evacuation of campus. Now, if you were there on the campus and you just saw the fire with your own two eyes, you know, you could see it, you're witnessing the flames, you see the burning building. Later on, if people say, how do you know that happened? What will you give as your evidence? You say, well, I experienced it directly. So, I mean, seeing is believing. It was right in front of me. I could feel the heat. I could see the flames. So I learned by being there that it happened. That's definitely evidence, and that's some of the strongest evidence. Now, on the other hand, though, there can also be evidence that comes from testimony. Testimonial evidence is evidence that is derived from what other people relay to you or say to you or report to you. This could be just interaction of a personal kind, like calling someone on the phone or texting them, or it could be indirect through like the media. You read a written report or a newscast that you watch, and you learn indirectly by means of the reported information what happened. So suppose that someone has testimonial evidence that the fire occurred. What would that mean? That meant that how did they learn about the fire? By being there? No. But rather by what? Testimony evidence. Just asking you to supply an answer to this one question through someone else. So like, how could they have notified you? You could have been off campus and heard a text message or group chat message or whatever from someone that was there. And they say, hey, don't come to campus. And you're like, why? They say, well, I'm standing here and there's a fire, so they told us to leave. Now, after that, you learned about the fire. And if someone asks you, how do you know? You won't be able to say, well, I had direct experience. Instead, you're going to say, no, my friend called me or texted me. When I saw his message, that's how I found out. So that's testimony. It's evidence that's coming to you from the report of another person or persons or agencies. Now, testimonial evidence is, of course, something that we have to rely on. Think about how important it is. If we didn't have testimony, then we wouldn't know anything about the world that existed before, you know, this current group of humans was alive, right? Because otherwise we would only be able to base evidence on things that we'd firsthand encountered. But like, you know, for example, that Columbus sailed to America in 1492, not because you were there, because none of us were alive, but only because the testimony of the events has survived through the generations in history textbooks and other written accounts. And that's how we've learned. So sometimes when you read reports in the media, you're reading about things that, of course, you're not there to see, but the reliability of the journalistic enterprise informs you, and that's kind of evidence itself. Okay, now a third type of evidence. There's evidence of experience, testimony. There's also inference. So inference is when you draw a conclusion based on other facts. So, for example, maybe you were not on campus, but you were off campus and you saw a whole bunch of fire trucks rushing towards the campus. And you just deduce, you put 2 and 2 together. Okay, well, fire trucks are there for emergencies like a fire. I see like about 10 of them rushing towards Cal State Fullerton. So I'm not on campus, I'm not in a position to see the fire, no one has contacted me to tell me that, but I infer that there must be a fire because where there's fire trucks, there's generally a fire. So inference. Another case, you arrive to the crime scene and you're the investigator. You see footprints, and these footprints match a distinctive kind of shoe that one suspect is known to have worn. Now, is that evidence by seeing the crime committed? No. Is it evidence by someone telling you who the culprit is? Also no. But it is inference. It's the collection of certain facts and then trying to draw conclusions from those facts, which you infer. So that is yet another main source of evidence. And then finally, there's memory. Memory is kind of just like something that preserves evidence and knowledge that we've had in the past for our use later in the future. So, I don't know, if you were at the fire earlier and now you're at home and someone asks you, well, how do you know it's there? You're no longer in the presence of it saying, well, I'm seeing it in front of me. All you can say is, well, I remember that it happened earlier today. And so in the mind's eye, you kind of have captured a mental image of the perceived events that you can recall later. We all know how memory works. If I ask you right now, remember our first meeting when we were all on Zoom, just kind of learning about the syllabus? That's not happening anymore, but the way that you know it happened is because the memory still exists in your mind. So memories allow us to preserve and maintain our access to previously perceived information or facts. So we use all of these. It's kind of, yeah, Julian, it's kind of like an extension of direct experience, but let me add this. Sometimes it's not an experience that is remembered, but a receipt of testimony. So if you read a story yesterday online in the, let's say, Washington Post, and you're just reading words, then you came by means of reading the testimony to learn the information reported. If I asked you a week later, well, about that story, you'll still be able to talk about it, but now only because you remember the testimonial intake of it from the past. So your memories can be of those things told to you or those things experienced. And so in that way, it's an extension of any prior receipt of information from whatever external source. Yeah. Yeah, and so we rely on these sources of evidence, but of course, hey, Eddie, they can, they're not 100% perfect, right? We do and can have false memories. We can even have incorrect visual perception, you know, people who are sleep deprived, under sedation, using certain drugs, maybe in an emotionally unstable or psychologically unhealthy state, can have false perception. Of course, testimony can misinform. That's classic. And so what do you do then? You just try to verify one source by means of others. So when they multiply corroborate each other, that gives you better justification, right? So if my experience is consistent with what people say and with what I remember, then I've got a very, very solid justification there. The problem is that sometimes these sources of evidence contradict. Like, say that somebody told you something happened, but you saw that that's not what happened. Now your experience is contradicted by their testimony. Usually in a situation like that, you would prioritize your experience because the person testifying, you might be thinking, well, they don't know because they weren't there. But of course, sometimes you could have been there and you could have had a false intake of the facts, especially if it was chaotic or if a lot of things were happening very fast. What if you have two conflicting sources of testimony? One friend texts you and they're like, hey, don't come to campus, there's a fire. 10 minutes later, another friend is like, hey, did you hear this thing about a fire? That's not true. People need to come back to campus. There's a rumor of a fire. Now you had two people talk. One says there was, one says there wasn't. Now you might have to make a relative judgment about who's the more reliable correspondent for you to judge their testimony to be the more accurate. So yeah, as a critical thinker, sometimes we do have to make, tricky decisions about how to weight the various incoming pieces of evidence that we have to sort through and evaluate. But again, yeah, the best case scenario is when they all kind of overlap and reinforce each other. When there are conflicts between them, you'll have to determine what's the more reliable source of evidence to prefer, because they can't all be correct if they are in contradiction with each other. Okay, now from there, we will talk about, as we resume on Wednesday, what are some unreliable sources of evidence, how to judge the credibility of experts, what are some resources that we can use for gaining justification and evidence, and what are some common errors and mistakes that we make when we try to process information. So we finish with chapter 4 next time. Today was kind of like bridging the divide between chapter 3 and 4. But now we're some ways into chapter 4. So you read the rest of the pages for that chapter. We'll finish it on Wednesday. And then we'll be good to go for this week as we prepare for our midterm review session and the exam next Wednesday. Other than that, like I said, I'm finishing up the grading of the last quiz you did, and that'll be all ready within this set of days this week before Friday. And I'll give everyone notice of the score and the answer key. All right then, so I guess I'll let you guys go. I appreciate it again for you guys showing up and helping through the lecture and paying attention. So have a good one. Be in touch by email if there's anything you need from me. And just have a great day, okay? Is everyone good? Let me know in the chat. And if I see that, then I guess we're good. Yeah? Are y'all good? Just let me know. I just want to get that little bit of, okay, thank you. Just double checking. Sometimes I'm not sure if my audio has cut out or if there was an interruption in the connection. So I check in to make sure everything's working. All right then, perfect. Thanks again, and I will certainly see you guys back on Wednesday. Have a good one till then. Bye-bye.